Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. I'm Untitled Chapter, the Director of the National Institute. But more importantly, this afternoon, I'm honoured and delighted to have been asked to chair the Productivity Commission. The Productivity Commission is a key part of UKRI's and ESRC's investment in productivity. With the establishment of the Productivity Institute last year, it was always in our mind to develop a commission specifically tasked with addressing the improvement of policies in the UK, to bring about better levels of productivity for all. There are no doubt many areas, and there are, as we know, many areas of the UK that have very high levels of productivity. But it's also the case that many areas do not, and some of the performance in the recent past has disappointed. And I'm delighted to be able to bring together 18 commissioners who will work with us over the next few years to poke and prod at the productivity puzzle to try and bring about better policy and improvement in outcomes for households across the country. I want to, this afternoon, what we'll do is, following my short remarks, I will introduce Bart van Ark, who's the Managing Director of the Productivity Institute, which is based at the Alliance Business School in Manchester, is one of our commissioners. And I'm delighted that they will also be joined virtually by Cecelia Wong, who's a professor at the University of Manchester, and then by Gillian Bristow, who is a professor at the University of Cardiff. And I'm also joined by a number of our commissioners this afternoon, some of whom you can see and some of whom you can't. I'm Dawn Holland to my left, to Bart van Ark's left. Dawn Holland, I should say, is at the UN, one of their major advisors on macroeconomic modelling. To Bart van Ark's left is Diane Coyle, Professor of Public Understanding in Economics at the University of Cambridge and Director of the Bennett Institute. Andy Westwood, Professor of Politics at the University of Manchester, and our Deputy Director at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, Adrian Pabst, who is a political scientist. And off camera, we'll try and bring him on camera at some point if we can. We're also joined, I'm very pleased to say, by Alan Barrett, my opposite number, and may I embarrass him by saying also because he's my close friend, Esri, the Dublin-based Economic and Social Research Institute, which I may just say was established and with the help of NISA back in 1960. I'm delighted that we're still close friends over all the bumps in the road that the relationships have gone between the two countries in the intervening period. So delighted you're with us today. Alan, when you think about productivity, cast your mind back to the 1960s. That was the decade in which I was born. And at that moment, a South Korean worker, he or she working for an hour at the office, would produce around $3 worth of output following 1 hour of work. If we move ahead to the decade just gone, the 2010s, some 50 years later, their grandson or granddaughter would have been in that same hour producing some $39 of output. So there's an incredible increase in productivity in a relatively poor country becoming a middle-income country over the course of my life. In that very same period, the UK, having started with the enormous advantage of being the first industrial nation from the 18th century, found itself in the decade of my birth in a world in which an average worker would produce some $19 of output for every hour they were at work, which of course was more than the equivalent South Korean worker. But their grandson or granddaughter in the most recent decade is producing somewhat under $60 per hour. So what we see is a key part of the productivity puzzle there. Other countries have had a rate of progress in productivity and hence prosperity that has not been matched by the UK. And what you might then say to me is, well, that's fine. The poorer countries of the world are getting better off. That's leading to a lower level of income inequality than we saw in the world before. And that's a very good thing. And I would agree. But the interesting question for me is, why have other countries been able to increase so rapidly over my lifetime? And then if we take the same comparison to other advanced economies, when we ask ourselves in that same decade of the 2010s, how much output would a German worker produce? How much output would an American worker produce? You've got a number that's safely in the 70s, $73 to $75 per hour, compared to the average UK worker at $59 per hour or somewhat less. And this is the productivity gap, the productivity shortfall, the thing that our Commission is going to try and address. At first blush, this productivity shortfall is simply about inefficiencies. Other countries are able to adopt productive practices that lead to more outcome per hour worked than we typically could do in the UK. Of course, that's an average. But if that continues, the relative and absolute decline, what happens as a nation is that you slide down the ladder of global prosperity and influence. You find yourself lagging behind. And that's when it leads to another set of problems. What it means is that people do not find themselves with the purchasing power that they anticipated having. They find themselves frustrated. They find themselves irritated. It leads to discontent. It leads to question marks about the way the country is governed and the economic settlement that we have in a particular country. And I think we only need to look at the referenda and the elections that we've had in this country over the last decade to understand that that is manifest. That is what happens. If we don't get these things right, people say, look, I'm not where I expected to be, and what I need is an improvement. As we come out of the COVID crisis, there is an interesting debate going on. As you may know, the Institute is based in Westminster or Smith Square, and we have the ear of all the debates that are going on in government as to how we recover from this crisis. And there's a strong stream of argument that says disruption is sufficient. We've disrupted the economy through Brexit. We've disrupted the economy as a result of COVID. We've learned to do things digitally. In fact, this meeting is hybrid. We've learned perhaps the importance of healthcare and education in a way that we might have forgotten otherwise, and we can reorient our economy. It will happen as if by magic. But the question I want to pose is disruption enough? Is it enough? Does it need to be managed? And if it needs to be managed, what kind of policy interventions do we need? It's very easy to cry for regional industrial policy, essentially transfers from the government to fixed industries and those that can shout the largest. But you also know from the intervening period of the 70s and 80s that that doesn't work either. What we need to do is think very hard about what upstream interventions the government needs to make that will enable the private sector over time to adopt the best practices, the best policies, and ultimately increase productivity. And all of this really, ultimately, is a question not of heartbeats and minutes and cabinet reshuffles. It's actually a process that will take decades. And that's why the Commission has a long horizon. We plan to work for a number of years to produce a number of reports and continue a dialogue with government and policymakers to try and improve policy. But we cannot pretend that even if we know the answers, that bringing about the solutions will be easy. On that note, I'd like to turn to the Managing Director of the Productivity Institute, Bart van Ark, and give him the chance to say some words. Thank you.
Thank you, Jagjeet, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this important moment where we have the pleasure to launch the Productivity Commission, which is the sort of final component of the Productivity Institute's portfolio of activity, namely to engage with the policy community in this country on productivity-related policy issues. The Productivity Institute, which is funded for 5 years by the Economic and Social Research Council, is headquartered at the Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester. And in addition to that, has 9 other partners we work with: the Universities of Sheffield, Warwick, Cambridge, King's College London, Cardiff, Glasgow, Queen's University Belfast, the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, and last but not least, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, where we are today, and from where the Productivity Commission will be run. The Productivity Institute is now 1 year underway, and it has 3 main parts to it. So the first is, of course, an academic research program that now includes as many as 80 researchers across these various institutions, covering 8 main themes. The themes include primarily the understanding of the chronic underinvestment, some of which Jackie just referred to, in human and organizational capital in the United Kingdom, as well as in knowledge. And we aim to contribute on a better understanding how investment in those sources of productivity can help to improve it over time. But we also think much about how to conceptualize productivity and how to measure it very well, how to connect it better with improving living standards and well-being across the country. And that, of course, means that the program is also very much focused on regional aspects of the UK productivity puzzle, which have received so much attention in recent years and certainly will also do so in the next few years. That means also a focus on institutional issues, governance issues, and policy issues. And last but not least, this very broad-based research program will also address some of the larger societal challenges that we're facing today, one of them being digital transformation and the other one being the greening of the economy. Our second focus of the Institute is the engagement with the business and policy community at the regional level. We have created 8 regional productivity forums, 5 in England and 1 in each of the developed nations. And that now includes as many as 130 business leaders, local policymakers, and academics from within each of those regions and devolved nations. This really helps us to live up to our commitment to understand productivity in a place-specific context. And we already have great experiences working with these regional productivity forums, and we see the first very place-specific projects coming out of these forums. So today, with the launch of the Productivity Commission, we add our third and final part to the Institute, which is the engagement with the policy community. First of all, here in Westminster and Whitehall, but I'm sure this reach of the Commission will go way beyond that, both across the nation and hopefully also internationally. Productivity commissions have a long history. Some of them existed as long ago as in the 1920s and 30s, but they really received a boost after the Second World War, when many European countries set up productivity commissions as part of the Marshall Plan. Later on, productivity commissions gained a lot more space, especially in Asia, where we still find some of the most and best well-run productivity commissions that focus not just on the economic issues of productivity, but also on technical training and on skills, and also on the broader societal issues like health and living standards. In the past 5 years, the European Union has also started a program of national productivity boards. The UK did not join that program, so in consultation with the EHRC and government officials, we thought this was a really good opportunity to create such a commission here as well as an independent commission linked to the work of the Productivity Institute. While linked to the Productivity Institute, let me stress that the Productivity Commission is an autonomous group of experts who together will decide on their areas of focus and rely on all possible sources of evidence to develop its viewpoints. The commissions are independent, and while we of course hope that they will use some of the insights being produced by the Productivity Institute, they will surely want to rely on other evidence too. While many productivity commissions around the world are more or less independent from government, this Productivity Commission finds itself at the far end of the scale by really trying to find its own voice based on access to the best experience and the best minds that we possibly have at our availability. And we are, of course, very grateful to the government's moral support in creating such an independent commission. We, of course, also hope that both our research community, our regional productivity forums, and the policy community will benefit from this commission's work. So to wrap up, let me first of all thank the National Institute and especially Jackie Chada to be the chair of this commission, Matt Pontelli, who's the head of policy for running the Productivity Commission and setting it up and getting it off the ground. We know it will be in very good hands with you, but above all, I'd like to thank all the commissioners, some of them here in the room, some of them here virtually, for giving their time, their energy to this enterprise. I'm honored to be part of it myself, and I'm looking forward to work with you all. Thank you.
That's wonderfully clear, as usual, from an idea of what we're trying to achieve with the Productivity Commission. If I may, I'd turn almost immediately, if I might, to Cecelia Wong from the University of Manchester to give her perspective as one of our 18 commissioners. I'm very grateful to be able to join us today. I know we'd all rather be in person, but it's great that you're with us today. Cecelia, may I just turn to you?
Thanks, Sajid. Good evening, everybody. And it is really great to see the launch of the Productivity Commission today in a very testing time. There's a Chinese phrase that put crisis and opportunity together. So I see the Commission's work will provide us with great opportunities, not only to examine the long-standing issue of dealing with how to best measure productivity with a more robust methodology and data, but more importantly, we would like to shift gear to understand productivity with a more holistic approach. Productivity is not just about wealth, And there is also international shift towards a broader conception of human and societal well-being. Especially recent time, we all talk about UN Habitat's Sustainable Development Goals and also its City Prosperity Index. So yes, productivity is driven by technology, R&D, and infrastructure. But we need to remember it has to be underpinned by a healthy and dynamic labor market with quality and educated workforce who is flexible and adaptable. And in a way, that's why many of us are academics and we are put our endeavor to training the next generation. But there's a lot of issue. We need to think about how to make this labor market to be healthy and dynamic. And we know that if the population have a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable and have a decent standard of living, it is really critical to sustain this healthy economy. And I think that all other commissioners like myself, we're committed to embrace the agenda to try to examine the relationship between well-being and quality of life or productivity. And we'll try to look into a broader range of areas beyond just economic. We will look at health, education, environment, and inclusive development. So that is very much the part on people. And my second part is about place. Being a spatial planner, I would say that for a long time, our attention had too much focusing on the national picture of the aggregate productivity. But as Jajit and Bart already hinted, indeed, the productivity capacity do vary widely across different parts of the UK. After the industrial restructuring, different places now have their own specialization and enterprise culture too. Through the recent work of the UK 2070 Commission, Cecelia and I are also the commissioner. Together with other academic research, we come to the conclusion that it is the combined result of the agglomeration tendencies for the market, uneven geography of innovation, and also the fragmentation of production across different places. And all these also then feed back into a vicious cycle that we also see very differential institutional capacities across different places. And all these hamper productivity and growth. And recent time, if we look at the infection pattern, especially I start doing some spatial mapping, and we can see under the pandemic, after the first 6 months, we can see the impact largely born in the more lagging behind area, especially the Northeast and the Northwest regions. And those areas lagging behind suffer from high deprivation. So all these make us to need to acknowledge the differential spatial context and capacities, and that translate into differential spatial accessibility to opportunities and development. And so we do need to devise more place-sensitive and sensible strategies to level up these lagging behind areas. And I hope that the Commission will lead on the debate about how such strategy can be devised to address the need of not just achieving aggregate growth maximization, but also spatial equity and growth enhancement across different parts of the UK. And another important area I want to point out about this spatial perspective is to acknowledge that many of our policy and planning, we don't really deliver to echo what happened in the actual functioning of the economy. Because even though we promote, the government try to promote agglomeration economies, but when we look at the spatial unit that go to deliver such endeavor, they tend to be based on local authority district, even combined authorities and local enterprise partnership. They are underbound. The actual boundary is much smaller than the functional labor market areas when we examine. So that means we ourselves maybe artificially create the barriers to run against the dynamic forces of agglomeration that led by the market. So there is a lot of interesting work and debate we can work on it. So these people and place agenda, and I hope that will put in the heart of the Productivity Commission. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecelia. Just a wonderful summary of some of the more granular issues I think we want to think about. One of the dangers is, as economists, we're thinking about the aggregate picture, but you're adding so much colour to the question of people in place. And I want to thank Bart as well for that excellent background to the development of productivity commissions elsewhere around the world. If I may, I'd like to bring in Gillian Bristow from the University of Cardiff, a professor there, who maybe can give some further colour to the kind of issues we'd be interested in as commissioners in the process of developing our thoughts and policy proposals. Gillian.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to say a few words this afternoon. Like everyone who's spoken already, I'm delighted to see the launch of the Productivity Commission and to be able to contribute to its work. And like Cecelia in particular, I'm really keen to emphasise that the Commission understands the spatial challenges that surround the UK's productivity issues, and that the whole productivity challenge facing the UK is not merely a national economic issue, it's most definitely a regional and a local one. So as a commission, we're really keen to convey that we understand there are significant and persistent income and productivity gaps between the regions and the devolved administrations of the UK. And we understand that the economic performance of London in particular heavily skews the national picture. So addressing the UK's productivity puzzle will require regional and local as well as national solutions. And as a commission, we'll be collecting evidence and providing summaries of research with an emphasis upon the devolved nations and the local governance landscape. And there are indeed, I think, good reasons to look at the interface or the connections between devolution and productivity, and indeed between the different factors that shape productivity outcomes in places. We know that less prosperous places also tend to be those places which are characterised by lower skills, lower productivity, and lower levels of well-being, and that these challenges are often interrelated in places. And what's more, I think the policy solutions to productivity are often easier to design and deliver through devolved governance arrangements. And one reason for this is because it's easier to tackle issues of skills, productivity, and well-being, where there's capacity locally to join up policies around things like education, health, transport, innovation, business support, and so on. And this is really evident in Wales, I think, where there's an increasingly interesting debate emerging around the relationship between productivity and well-being. The productivity gap between Wales and the rest of the UK has remained stubbornly persistent as the Welsh economy has struggled to shake off the legacy of its heavy industrial past. But interestingly, policy development in Wales is now shaped by quite a unique piece of legislation, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And this seeks to align policy objectives in Wales to a wider set of social and environmental well-being goals, away then from a sole focus on material economic prosperity. Now, this could, I suppose, be seen as at odds with the UK's levelling up agenda and with productivity policy objectives. But in practice, and as many of my colleagues here in Wales have been saying, there's considerable scope within the Welsh approach to focus attention on inclusive and clean economic growth, particularly as the nation begins to emerge from the pandemic. Now this, of course, requires long-term thinking, it requires investment in clean technology sectors and so on, but it's perhaps just one example of how there's scope to learn from and to better understand the very specific nature of the productivity challenges that face different constituent parts of the UK, of its nations and its regions. So, like everyone who's spoken, I'm really keen to be involved in the work of the Commission. We're really keen to get started, and thank you very much for listening.
Just excellent, Gillian. I just hearing the conversations already kicked off by Bart, Gillian, Cecelia really tells us we're tremendously lucky to have your time as commissioners, but also your expertise that you're bringing and the focus. We have a very broad focus. Because productivity affects everything and is affected by everything, but to have people with specific expertise in the areas that you have and you're able to bring, I think augurs very well for where we're going to end up as a commission here. I would encourage people to look at the breadth of the 18 commissions that we have. Of course, I'm joined by a number of commissioners in person today, and I just want to see them catch their eye to anything they'd want to say at this stage, either in response or in addition to the points that have already been raised. Diane.
I'll say a word, if
Yes,
I may.
Please, Diane.
So really nice introductions from everybody, and it's very exciting to be in at the launch. I just wanted to pick up on Gillian's comments about the future generations perspective in Wales, which I think is really important, embedding sustainability in long-term thinking. One of the dysfunctions, I suppose, of what we've gone through in the UK is very short-term thinking, and so that's really welcome. One of the challenges, though, is that well-being, important as it is highly correlated with income. So you don't compensate, if you like, for a lack of income by increasing well-being in some way. These things are really tightly correlated with each other, and those links over the short and the long term are the issues that we're going to be trying to get to the heart of. But it's terribly important, and I'm really glad Julian raised it.
Thank you very much, Diane. So a thread going through a lot of the discussion about people, but also place and spatial issues. And if I could hear Julian and Cecelia almost arguing for more power to regions, devolved nations, because these things are incredibly local. Education, health, training, it's all personal. I mean, unless you can log in online and do these things, but essentially, they're local. So I wonder what that augurs for the way that we run this country. Do we have any thoughts there as the kind of questions we might want to be thinking about as commissioners? Because there's one thing about expenditure, but then you're into the question of taxation as well. Are there any issues there that we particularly want to be highlighting? I put it, if I may just put that question to either of our eminent political scientists, Andy Westwood or Adrian Powell, and you don't have to answer the question now. I'm just sort of picking up what I'm hearing and thinking, where does that take us? Because things are so centralised to that building a mile over there, Treasury. Is that part of the problem? And to hear Diane talk about short-termism, you've only got to read the memoirs of politicians or civil servants to know that they're mostly about solving the crisis that landed this morning. They're not about coming up with solutions for problems that might emerge a few years down the line. So there's two aspects. There's the locality and the time horizon.
Well, short-termism has already been mentioned by Diane, and the other one is over-centralisation. Yeah. We have a system of governance across the United Kingdom that is still more highly centralised than almost any other in the OECD. That is true for central government, and even, I fear, for some of the aspects of the devolved settlement. I'm all in favour of devolution, but what we see is the risk that we replicate centralism at the level of the Scottish, the Welsh government, and indeed the Northern Ireland government, and we don't push it down to the subnational level there, to the regional and to local level. What about local government? How can we join up these things? And we haven't really got a very good sense of what institutions are required to make sure that the national, the regional, and the local work together, because it's not going to be one that will solve it. And I think that's one of the key questions. What institutions do we have that can be either renewed, or what institutions do we need in order to make that a reality?
Andy, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd very much add to what Adrian and others have said, and thinking particularly about our institutional and our kind of policy frameworks that we've adopted in lots of different silos at different times to think about these things. One of our problems has been sticking to anything for very long. That short-termism that Diane mentioned, that absolutely affects our kind of policy making response to productivity in any of its constituent parts. So, whether that's the architecture at the local level or at an institutional level within a sector like education, for example, we may have stumbled on some of the right answers, but we would never know because we would change them quite happily every few years. So, there's also a kind of state of mind about once we've come across some of the right solutions, about how we deliver them and how we stick to them. And that, I think, has been a big problem for policy making, certainly throughout the UK, but even more so perhaps in England.
Thank you, Andy. Just say we're able to take questions from audience participants. Use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we have people here who should be able to filter that question back to us so we can try and answer those questions in the time that remains. I wonder if I may bring in two other commissioners as well who are here today and experts in the area. One is Alan. I know you're off camera, but there are at least two questions I would like to ask you coming over from Dublin today. This short-termism is something that's talked about so often with respect to the United Kingdom, and you may not feel able to answer this question, but I'll ask it anyway. To what extent does it concern you in Ireland, the question of short-termism? But maybe the subsequent question that you may be very well placed to help us understand is how important is trade in thinking about productivity? It's not something anyone's talked about just yet, but it's clearly in some way how we learn and develop our ideas is trading with other countries and developing international best practice. And that's something which I think in many fields, without embarrassing you, Ireland has done very well in the last few decades. So, I mean, two types of questions. And does that therefore reflect more long-term thinking in Ireland? Just to bring those two into one question.
Let me try and deal first with the issue of the long termism and short termism. So, I mean, I think Ireland presents an interesting example in that we managed to move from being a less developed economy in many ways to being ours is a story of convergence over a period of time. And I think one of the great lessons from that, okay, a range of lessons, but governance matter. I'm looking at the political scientists when I say this, that in a sense, one of the spurs to longer term thinking was actually the European Union and the manner in which they spent funds within Ireland. So there was a need to have a set of coherent, integrated investments, public investments in areas of transport infrastructure and a variety of other infrastructures. So in a sense, you had an outside agency that had a very, very positive effect, not just in terms of giving money, but almost enforcing strategic thinking. And I think it's, if it had just been left to the politicians in the country, I don't think they would have performed as well, but they only got the money on the basis of, what happened. On the trade issue, there's another, it's an interesting one. I'm going to look at the trade issue in a slightly different way. Ireland's productivity performance we do embarrassingly well. That's because we imported high productivity growth. Okay, through that really extraordinarily successful foreign direct investment strategy, that we've ended up with this economy, and it goes to the points that were being made earlier on about the regional dimensions. But in the Republic of Ireland, you have this very strange that it's not even regional. You have two economies almost existing side by side, where you've got the high productive foreign direct investment sector, and then much more lowly productive domestic sector. And one of the great productivity puzzles in Ireland has always been, why hasn't there been a greater spillover from one to the other? Because I think as economists, we always think that these sort of things will wash through neatly and all boats will be lifted. So again, like everybody, I think, around the table, we come with a certain understanding of what's worked and what hasn't worked, but there are probably more questions. But like everybody else, I'm really looking forward to sort of bringing the Irish perspective and possibly more importantly, the Northern Ireland issues as well. Yes. Because again, I think it would be generally understood that Northern Ireland has had a particular problem in terms of lower productivity, and the implications there have been acute.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm sorry you're on camera, but I just want to say that that's really interesting what you say about lack of spillovers from the high productivity area to the low productivity area. We're finding very similar results in the UK with some of the regional work some of my colleagues are doing, trying to understand whether the high productivity areas of London and the South East are spilling over to the other regions of the UK, and there's precious little evidence of it, which surprised me. But of course, I believe my colleagues' results. I'm trying to understand why that is, and that could be initial conditions, could be lack of trade, it could be constraints to do with skill levels of labour. We're trying to understand what the reasons are, if there is results to write, and that's incredibly interesting to hear the same from Ireland. Just delighted as well to be joined by another commissioner, Chris Pissarides, Professor of Economics at the LSE. If you forgive me, I'll turn to you in just a second. I just want to ask Dawn Holland, who's our commissioner from the United Nations and one of their advisors on macroeconomics, just to sort of give us you're one of the world's leading experts on the macroeconomics of climate change. We're very grateful for your long-standing association with the National Institute. I just wonder where climate change sits in the productivity puzzle. Is it something that is a further constraint, or does it give us an opportunity to move to new forms of technology and catch up better than we would otherwise? That's a really big question to ask you. We've worked together for a number of years and you're used to that. So
well, I think I'd make 2 points on that. So the first, I think, is sort of tying into a lot of the points that Cecelia and Diane was making is that there's one of the reasons why we study productivity is because we're interested in the well-being of individuals and how that interacts with them, and that there isn't a simple trade-off between income versus well-being. Coming from the UN, I'm often faced with the people saying, why do we need more growth in wealthy countries? Chronic overconsumption is one of the biggest causes of environmental damage, and we're sort of stealing from our poor children and from poor parts of the world, and so it's sort of perpetuating these inequalities. climate change is tied into that, obviously, but I would, it will certainly, it's about changing the way we do things rather than stopping doing things. But thinking very carefully about those interactions between, so it's not just about creating more stuff, but creating it, how we create it, and the interactions of that with the well-being of the people that we're sort of aiming for.
And what's coming, yeah, that's very good, thank you. What's coming across in all the answers is how complex this is. This is not an easy, there's no silver bullet in the sense. Chris, may I bring you in? Chris Pisurius, Professor of Economics at the others.
Yes, thank you very much, Jack. This is like previous commissioners, I'm very pleased to be part of this commission, and it's a very important problem. I look forward to seeing results. We just got a Nuffield Foundation grant at the Institute for the Future of Work to study some of the issues that have already been raised that concern the unequal performance of different regions, and what stops the spillovers that were mentioned just a minute ago. What I wanted to say, to put forward now, is what I consider one of the biggest puzzles, and in fact I've been considering that big puzzle. I've been thinking about it rather in association with my colleagues here at the first Center for Labor Economics and then Center for Economic Performance, is why the inequalities persist to the extent that they do. See, when we teach basic economics, we say that if there is free mobility of labor and capital, then you expect inequalities in productivity and pay to be even out after a long time, even if that's a very long time. And in fact, if you look at the data on interregional migration, for example, within the UK, you do get movements in the right direction. London has a lot more people of working age that were born outside London than Newcastle, for example, or even Birmingham. I would think you need maybe you need to adjust for international migration, but even if you include international migration, I'm sure that's the case. Now, if you look at it as an economist, that's the right response of labor to the productivity differences amongst these regions. But despite the fact that they've been taking place for decades and decades, the gaps are not closing. And I think that's a big puzzle. I remember, in fact, discussing this with Richard Layard around 1980 at the Center for Labor Economics, and saying why. And he said there's only one explanation, and that means that the positive shocks that regions get are not one-off, that London gets positive shocks all the time, more positive than other regions, and it goes on and on. And that's something that obviously it's logical. If you look at the equations, you need to have something like that to give you the this outcome that I described, but it doesn't make sense to me. And if the Productivity Commission could shed light in the persistence of those inequalities, I think it would be a great achievement, at least in my mind. I don't know if you guys do agree.
Thank you ever so much, Chris. It's always a delight to hear from you. I mean, clearly, if our answer is shocks, then we're not explaining anything. We're asking something else outside our system to explain the outcomes. So clearly, we have to go a little bit beyond Richard Layard's helpful, but perhaps not complete answer to the productivity puzzle. We have a couple of questions that come in, which I'm afraid I have to read off my phone, unless we can't get them online. No. So Richard Burge from the London Chamber of Commerce, and I kind of wonder, I don't want to land you in it, Bart, but perhaps you can help with the answer, and then we can sort of work on it together. The question is, how will the Commission engage micro and small businesses on this question of productivity? These are enterprises that are run on a very personal basis, and productivity looks like an aggregate figure of little direct relevance, or more importantly, utility to them. So I wonder if you could.
It's a great question, and it's a very important focus, because we do know that one of the issues in the UK, again compared to other countries is the very long tail, as we call it, of less productive firms. All countries have this, but in the UK we have, of course, a group of leading firms that are into productivity frontier, but a very long tail. And many of those companies in the long tail are smaller and medium-sized companies. So all our regional productivity forums have actually a very heavy focus on the role of small and medium enterprise. And I think there are two components to this, and then I'll let some other commissioners work a bit on this as well. One is many of these firms are in what we sometimes call the foundational economy, and that's sort of, the sector and the industries that are there in any place where people live, whether it's retail or restaurants or the gym, or it's part of the things that sort of, make our lives livable. And many of these enterprises in the foundational economy tend to be quite small, tend to have limited opportunity to really scale up, which is an important part of the productivity story. But at the same time, are highly dependent on access to skills and ways for these companies to innovate through the human capital that they can make an investment in. So I think that is one area where I think a lot of the focus on small medium enterprises. The other focus is the question why a lot of these small medium enterprises are not as tied into supply chains as you would desire. We know that a lot of productivity growth in small and medium enterprises is coming from the fact that they're part of a supply chain, that there's a change of technology from larger firms to smaller firms. That's the way they grow, that's the way they go out of their region and operate in other markets. And again, we see that there are quite a few barriers for companies that should become part of a supply chain. And this really requires what we sometimes call regional ecosystems, where both large companies and small companies work together, have together access to the right skills and the right technologies to make it happen. So I think those are some of the areas where small medium enterprise really needs to get a lot of focus in the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Mark. Just before I move on, Gillian or Cecelia, or anybody else want to add anything to that answer? Which, as far as I'm concerned, that was an alpha plus answer. I don't think anything else. Does anybody want to add? No, thank you very much. So I have another question from Nazira Bradley from the Innovation for Growth Institute, and it's talking about the long-term driver of productivity and growth is innovation, similar to the point Mark was making. And the vehicle of driving innovation through economies are firms. While small firms are nimble innovators, the real benefit of that innovation is the value added generated as firms scale up. Revenue of large firms is nearly 700 times higher than small firms from Bayes data. ECB data shows European firms, this factor is around 300 to 400, yet UK innovative firms do not scale up. UK large firms are 1/8 of the share of GDP. These are all numbers from Nazira Bradley. I'm sure they're right, but I haven't had time to check them. Are 1/8 of the share of the GDP relative to the US. We need to focus on firm scale up, which I think is something Bart just talked about. This needs long-term finance, 10 to 15 years rather than short-term finance, but also ownership. US uses dual class shares to enable founders to have control. Good or bad, look at Elon Musk. Perhaps I won't if you don't mind, Nazira. I'll leave that to others. Yet they launched this the space something or other. They seem to be driven to enable firms to grow over a longer period. The listings review has proposed the UK adopt this as well. What is your view on all these issues? So very much about how small firms scale up and access to finance. I don't know whether one has a particular angle on that they'd like to reply.
I don't mind starting if
Thank
somebody
you.
else
I was trying to catch you. I was trying to catch you right.
I divide this up into different kinds of firms actually, and also distinguish between technology innovation, the shiny space rocket stuff that we all immediately think about, process innovations that are doing something more effectively in a given market, and then the diffusion of technologies, which is actually equally important. And they're not all going to be frontier firms, but we want many firms to be using frontier technologies, no matter if we have to import them from somewhere else. So I distinguish between those different types of firm, for one thing. On the scale-up problem, I think it is a challenge, and we've got a decent VC industry, certainly compared to the past. But public equity markets are failing to provide the finance. And I don't entirely understand that nexus of problems. And I think it's something that the Commission should definitely have a look at. And obviously bank lending here is not going to fill that gap. So there's certainly a scale-up problem for technology companies. And as we know, a lot of them simply sell out to a big American or Chinese or European firm as the option for founders to get some return on their investments.
Thank you. And certainly we're going to look at finance and we're going to look at this scaling up problem. I had a question from one of our colleagues, a provocative question from one of our colleagues. Do forgive me, Gillian and Cecelia. One thing that doesn't happen in the Institute is that colleagues ask each other provocative questions, so I hope you'll forgive me in putting this to you. But the question we have from Paul Mortimer-Lee is, has regional policy not been the thing holding back productivity, in the sense in which productivity maybe is about encouraging rural-urban migration, and what we need to do is get more people moving to London and the South East. I'm not sure that's entirely what he meant, but Paul is a force of nature, if I could say, a very pleasant force of nature, but is asking us that question, you know, is regional policy part of the problem? And if it is, what kind of regional policy would you have in place? And I'm asking Gillian and Cecelia because we've both worked on the 2070 Commission and we have some views on these things. So perhaps I could just bring you in for your responses to that kind of sense, you know, direct question from Paul.
Okay,
Gillian,
shall I go first? Perhaps on that one. It's a really good question. It's, I suppose, the first thought that I have essentially is that what perhaps we've been lacking is that coherence of regional policy interventions and issues. And I think that's something that certainly came through in the work on the UK 2070 Commission, which was calling for a sort of a national spatial plan, if you like. So maybe that's one thing that we could be picking up on, is that coordination of the different policy interventions, which in and of themselves are often trying to do the right thing, but perhaps, you know, we've lacked that overarching spatial framework within which to coordinate and you know, yes, at those different actions. Cecelia may also have comments, of course.
We'll try to the evidence session. Yeah, but anyway, please.
Yeah, I can add something as well. I think it echoes what Diane just said about the short-termism. I actually look at the history of regional planning. A long time ago, did a paper. Find these countries start thinking about regional planning wherever we're in war or in crisis. So we tend to use regional as something that can save us, but never systematically or strategically really adopt it as a policy. The last time during the Labour government, when we have regional, we actually fragmented it. We have the RDA dealing with economic development. We have the regional planning body dealing with the space strategy. There's no integration. By the time we try to integrate, we have the coalition government, then kill off everything. So that tells us the story is we swing the pendulum. And it's very difficult if we can't really provide the strategic direction. In comparison to Germany, the Länder is much more coherent and consistent, and the regional level really have strong power to go to make them as an autonomy region to do things. The other point I want to add is, I think relate to what Chris work about the migration. I think the people and place is very interesting. We can educate it and train up the people. When I was in Manchester doing the forum, people say the creative and cultural industry, we get really good people in Manchester, but London offer them more money. London more opportunity is a bigger agglomeration there. So we train up the people, they will leave. So the other issue, very important, I think Rose Buffwell say in the another meeting, say about retention of people. So well-being and quality of life also say, even you get now good people, can you keep them? Or you train them up, they just go. So that end up will be incubator for the rest of the country, you know, to train up people, just send to somewhere else. So that is something we need to think about, this very complex intricate relationship between people and place.
Thank you very much, Cecelia. I think the agglomeration issue and the need to have a deep pool of labour so it stays where that pool wants to be, rather than draining back to other pools, is an incredibly interesting point, one that we will be thinking about. We have a question from Sanjeev Mahajan from the ONS. And I'm kind of tempted to put this to Andy and Adrian, not necessarily because I think you're the only ones who can answer this, but the rest of us are trying not to be cynical. And the reason I'm putting that is for the following reason. Sanjeev's asking, he thinks that with technology and societal issues, short-termism is here to stay. Is COVID masking serious Brexit problems? But with all these things in the background, how, he doesn't use this word, but how the heck can the Productivity Commission influence UK government policy? That's really come up. How are we going to do that? How are we going to bring about effect change? Which of course is the mission of this institute anyway, to improve policy. How he's asking how we can do it. I suspect he's, grinding his own teeth at issues he might have had at the ONS. But Sanjeev, I don't have any information on that. I'm saying that as in jest at the moment. I'm sure it's an absolute delight to deal with the government from the ONS. But how are we going to have that? How are we going to go into Downing Street, number 10 or number 11, and say that this is what you need to do? Or is that not possible?
Well, I think you've got to at least want to try.
Right.
I mean, it sounds an obvious point, but it's an important one.
Yeah.
It would be very easy for us to stand apart from the kind of, what often feels like the hand-to-hand combat of policy making on a day-to-day basis in this government, or frankly in any other of the last couple of decades.
Yes.
And say, we'll give you some of the answers and we'll let you get on with it. That would be the easy way to structure this commission. I think, but that can't be how we operate. We have to engage in dialogue as constructive as we can make it over policies that are being made every day. And we've got a spending review coming up. Already this year, we've seen an innovation strategy, a skills strategy, an energy strategy, all sorts of different things on infrastructure. We've got levelling up deals at city region levels, at regional level, at county level, at town level. We can critique those things, we should critique those things, and we can give some constructive ideas about the best geographical kind of levels with which to offer ideas. But I think we have to go into this commission with a mindset that says we will engage with those policy announcements, those policy ideas, and we'll try and work with what we've got. You can only play with the system that's in front of you, even if it's changing every few minutes. And so I think we have to commit to working as closely with the problems that not just our politicians but our officials and agencies and institutions are facing across all 4 nations. And I think that's like I say, it sounds a little bit trite that we have to do that, but it's almost too easy to not do it.
That's right, and we've built in a structure where we have a senior government policymaker as an observer of what we do. That person is in a position to sort of say, well, actually, we're thinking about X and Y at the moment as well. Could you try and give us some answer? And we also have built in regular sessions where we're going to be talking to government departments and their people about the issues they're currently facing. So that is kind of baked into this. As Bart said, we've got tacit government approval to set up this commission, and they want to know what we are up. Get that right? And we're going to continue to do that. But so the key economic departments are ones that we're going to talk to on a regular basis. But
can I briefly add to this, because as I said, we're a year into discussing these things already with government officials, and I think what I find is that government officials are actually keen on getting advice around productivity issues. We don't have a department of productivity, we don't have a productivity minister, and actually many departments, we've been talking to lots of different entities in government, have this issue around productivity somehow related to their agenda, but not core. So we're not just talking to Treasury and Base, although we do. We're also talking to Education Department, to Housing Department, to DEFRA. So we see that this is a topic across governments. And my experience so far has been that government officials are actually keen to help them to bring these issues together, so that they can decide what their focus on these topics is going to be.
So they're prepared to absorb information. Then our next question is, how do we change the policies? I feel Adrian is about to weigh in.
I wanted to just add to what's been said by saying that, first of all, I'm not sure short-termism is just here to stay in the same sort of way. And we've also seen some momentous events that have changed the dynamics. Brexit was both a catalyst for all sorts of disruption, but also revealing of, deep, disparities of wealth and power that had been built up for decades. We know that technology doesn't just emerge overnight. There's a long incubation. So all of these things are very long-term, as well as, of course, have short-term consequences. But I also feel that all governments tend to want to leave some kind of legacy. And that could be vanity projects, which I very much doubt we would find convincing or a good thing for the country. But they can also be good legacies. And one of them could be institution building, where you can say to them, you can leave behind a better institutional ecology than the one you found. So I think there's an opportunity. It's not to say that it will happen, but I think, as my colleagues have already indicated, there's an openness, because on productivity, while we know there's a problem, we might not necessarily understand the nature of it that well, and we certainly don't necessarily know what the answers are. So I think the openness, the opportunity is here, and that's a huge space for us to move into.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I've had an interesting question from my friend, the eminent social scientist Bernard Casey. And Bernard's asking whether we're measuring productivity outside of manufacturing. Are we interested in services, public sector productivity, and that in financial services? And I'll just answer that immediately. Yes, Bernard, we are. We're not just looking at manufacturing. Of course, a lot of the techniques for measuring productivity came out of understanding what manufacturing production plants were doing. And the Institute itself has a long history of trying to understand that, going back some years to the work of Sig Price. But clearly trying to understand how we measure productivity in the service sector and in the financial sector and overall in the economy is a key part of what we do. We have a theme on measurement as well as a lab, a statistical lab, developed to try and understand better patterns in productivity at a granular level across sectors, households in the different parts of the country. So I think the answer, Bernard, is an emphatic yes to that question. But thank you for putting it. It's always nice to hear a question from you. We are coming up to the top of the hour, which makes me sound like I'm running a broadcast, but maybe I am. But I want to give everyone a chance for a final word or two rather than from me. And I'm going to, just because of the nature of these things, look to the screen first. So perhaps I could go Chris, Celia, then Gillian, and then I'll go down the line here to give everyone a final word or two. So perhaps in a minute, are there any final comments you'd like to make or responses that I didn't give you a chance to make earlier on? So Chris, Cecelia, then Gillian to begin with, and we'll go down the line. Chris.
It's me, Chris. It's fairly common name, so I wasn't sure.
But look, almost as common as Jagjeet.
Well, I mean, what can I say? I just look forward to seeing more evidence, really, and I was quite interested by the questions on small firms. I think understanding small firms is important, and we don't really know enough. You know, these differences between Britain and other countries that were mentioned are very important. Again, we don't know the reason for those differences. So I'm joining the Commission with completely an open mind. I mean, I was on the LSE Growth Commission that discussed many of these issues. This one is more focused on productivity. As I mentioned before, I'm involved in a big project that compares outcomes in different regions of the country. So it's all part of this long-term project.
I'm delighted.
Look forward to the meetings. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Cecelia and/or Gillian, is there any final words you want to say?
Just echo Chris, I think it is a long-term challenging project. And I'm really looking forward to receive more challenging questions from Lisa. And I think because we all come from different background with different research interests, I think that sort of cross-fertilization and also challenging each other will be very good, and hope that the Commission can come up with some good work and bring the debate forward.
Very much. Thank you very much. That's it. And Gillian, anything you'd like to add?
Just very briefly, very much the same. Really looking forward to the work proceeding. I think bringing in an international comparison wherever relevant and learning from, you mentioned, you know, the work of other productivity commissions would be useful, of course, as well. But I think we've certainly got a challenge, and I'm really keen to start work on it.
Thank you, Gillian. My colleagues here today, just before asking you to speak, the pub is open, so everyone like to make any final comments. Bart, I must ask you this.
Yeah, I was asked earlier this week by a prominent person what was the most important thing I had learned in the past year. And it was not difficult for me to find the answer. I am amazed and so pleased about the amount of thinking around these kind of topics here in the UK, and to be honest, better than what I've seen in many other countries. At the same time, I'm deeply distressed about the amount of fragmentation, the lack of discourse between various parties. This is going to be hard work. Collaborating is not simple. It's different disciplines, it's different sectors, it's different regions, it's different level of government. It's really got to be hard work, and it needs commitment. But you know, we have the ingredients to get it done. So that's why I'm excited about it.
Okay, we have the ingredients to bake the cake.
Yes,
very much, everyone. I'll leave you with one final thought, if I may, or one point, is that we are going to have 4 evidence sessions every year over the next few years. The first evidence is on sizing the problem. Let's make a clear statement as to what we think the problem is nationally, regionally, and sectorally, both in terms of our history, but also in terms of the international comparison that Julian called for. Let's make a statement that people can understand and work to. And so in the next week or so, Matt Pantelli will be issuing a call for written evidence. And after that, we'll be moving towards an oral evidence session on the 23rd of November. So do make a note of that in your diaries. That will be in the morning at 9 o'clock. And we'll be having other evidence sessions as well. For more information, subscribe on our website to our various press releases. The reports will be coming out. There'll be reports on the evidence that we've got, which will be the statements as to what we've found. And then there'll be reports on policy proposals that we will be coming out with. Ultimately, we want you to participate, get involved, help us do a better job, help us improve the productivity in this country and in the rest of the world. There are positive spillovers, I believe, from doing things better here. The rest of the world does note, it does follow. So let's try and get this right. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to my wonderful co-commissioners. Thank you for those of you who've joined us down the line, but also particularly, if I may, just embarrass Neil Lakeland and Shane Connolly at NISA for getting this together in, I can only say, hybrid and difficult circumstances, and also for Matt Pantelli for joining us and coming over from the Treasury Committee to join us to work on the Productivity Commission with us. Welcome. You can now go on your honeymoon. Thank you all very much. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.